the fifth installation of the Marketing Rant by Catalyst Marketing. I'm Mariah Kamei. I'm joined by Robin Meliani. Damn it, I knew I was going to do that. Maybe we keep it in because it's kind of funny.
Let's go.
Doug Schwartz and Trevor Keating. Guys, we are going to do something that is taking us a little bit out of our comfort zone, but we feel like it is super important to do. And that is to talk a little bit about the role of marketing and brands in the Black Lives Matter movement, So certainly something that I'm sure everyone has been following as of late, and certainly something we feel has woken up many Americans to the different reality people of color experience in our nation. So I think a lot of folks that are working in the marketing world and also just generally for companies are struggling with when and how and if they should get involved in the movement. So I was going to run some data points by you guys and then get your opinions on the subject matter. So the first one is about in 2019, some folks conducted a survey asking consumers if they thought brands should take a stand on issues like climate change and social issues. And they actually found that about 2/3 of consumers did want brands to take a stand. We also just got some new data released last month showing that even if speaking up on issues like Black Lives Matter is politically divisive, most people agree it's worse to say nothing at all. So folks actually want you to say something instead of remaining silent. Counterpoint to that, a lot of brands don't feel like that is their position, as they are not people, to have political views. We have a marketer named Toby Ralph saying it's a preposterous view that brands should hold political views and express them. Brands are not people. And then in terms of some interesting things that brands have done, on June 2nd, Lego called for all marketing of police-related products to be removed. And they also pledged $4 million in donations. McDonald's pledged $1 million to the NAACP. And they actually the NAACP made approximately $21 billion in revenue in 2019. And then even the United Kingdom has got involved. I'm sure you guys have seen in the headlines some statues being toppled into rivers. But they also, Yorkshire Tea and PG Tips, told critics that Black Lives Matter movement, if they disagreed with it, that they should stop buying their tea. So guys, what advice would you give your clients if they were to come to you and ask you how to get involved or if to get involved?
Well, I feel very strongly that this is a different time. And the notion that brands aren't people, I think is completely inaccurate. Brands represent people. And there was a shift that happened a while back where millennials, there were stats that show that millennials would rather work for a more socially responsible company and were willing to take a pay cut to work for companies like that versus companies that stood for nothing. And I think at this time, the brands that are standing up and saying something and being bold about this are the brands to be hailed. And there were a couple ones that, that I came across that I thought have done this especially well. And the first of which is a really interesting brand called Uncommon Goods. And it's an e-commerce site that just sells like funny little knick-knacky type gifts. Actually, some pretty good gifts on there. But they came out with this amazing statement, and I printed it off because I had to cite some of it. But I thought they did such an exceptional job of making it really clear about their stance on Black Lives Matter, and that this is a work in progress. And the subject line was what grabbed me immediately, and it said we can do more. So immediately that compelled me to read, which as a marketer is really hard to get me to do. But then they sent this really long email, and in the second paragraph, it says, when Uncommon Goods says Black Lives Matter, we mean that we are standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and pledging to actively work towards creating a world that is safe for people of color. We mean that we intend to dedicate ourselves to this work for as long as it takes. Black lives are precious and important. And then they go on to explain this, and then they talk about the 3 ways that they're going to take a stance on this. And the first of which, because they're a reseller of goods, it's like talking about working with more Black-owned businesses. And then they talk about educating their team members and people of their company. And then they talk about their philanthropic efforts that they're going to make, and what they're going to donate, and from a financial perspective. And I just thought, I love that brands are standing up and saying, we haven't done a good job. And to be that, to be able to fall on your sword and say that, I think makes people want to buy from you. When you can say, what we've done is not good enough, and we are taking a stance, and we will do what it takes to try and create change, which I think is just so noble for brands to do. And I think the big brands, like some of these Uncommon Goods. The other one that I thought did a really good job was Proctor and Gamble. Mm-hmm. So, and apparently they've done this for the last couple of years, and I haven't been privy to it, but they stood up against the LGBTQ community and did a whole video about how interviewing all these people, where they talk about how people pause when they see them. If it's 2 women together, 2 men together, trans, etc., and just the powerful impact, these people telling their story about people pausing. And so P&G's made a stand about this, and that we're not going to tolerate that. So I think it's an important time for brands to stand up, and people want to buy from you when you do take a stand.
Well, and I think there's a couple of interesting nuances you bring up in that case study, which is the willingness to be vulnerable, to say, maybe we're not going to get this right. It's a work in progress, right? And then also showing what actions you're going to take, because a lot of companies, including Nike, have gotten a little bit of flack for making broad statements and then not really backing it up, right? So how are you going to diversify your boards? How are you going to do things that actually put your money where your mouth is?
Right. And I think it's legitimate to have that fear of doing something wrong and not quite doing it right. And I think as consumers, we're willing to show those brands and those companies grace during this time, because I think it's a detriment if you don't do anything.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting one, just given that there's so many brands that I think are afraid to do something wrong or even just document their opinion and feelings. In this day and age, it is scary to document how you feel in this very moment, because information changes every single day and your stance can change. But it's hard for a brand, because a brand, I feel like, it's a little bit harder for them to audible and say, okay, I did say that at one point, maybe it was 5 years, 10 years ago, and now I don't feel that way based on modern information and modern culture. And I think it's a little bit, you're hesitant to put that in writing, because 10 years from now, you have to think about how much change is probably going to exist again, and what we're going to look back and be like, what were we thinking at this time? We didn't know anything. How was that even a problem? And what are the modern day problems? So I think it is a little scary to put the pen to paper, but I think what a lot of consumers are respectful of is, we wear brands every single day. And I am a huge advocate of, I will just buy the brand because I'm like, nope, it's consistent, it's reliable, I already know them, I love them. And creating that reliance and reliability and love for the brand didn't happen just because you made a product. Because frankly, I don't know the difference of the material and the jacket and whatever. I'm buying a brand, and usually it's what you stand for, and usually it's kind of what you do for our society or environment or whatever you really care about. So I think I like the idea of taking a stance right now, just because a lot of your consumers probably already know your stance as it is. They just want to hear you say it. They aren't riding in the same direction as you for this long, because it does come through. They see the news behind the scenes of what you really do, what environmental impacts you have. I'll use a really negative example of someone like Smithfield, who is always in the headlines. Their business is really to try and stay out of the headlines, and a lot of times they end up in it from their factories and things like that, but they don't do a lot for environmental impacts, and so it's a little harder for them to take a stance on environmental things. But when you jump into other brands who are like Nike, historical for really taking a strong stance in one direction, and it's not I mean, I hope that it wasn't for on day one, knowing that it was going to pay dividends, but it did. Like they are very notable all the way back to the Colin Kaepernick era. But I mean, that was a scary, scary time for them, I'm sure. And they got a lot of backlash. But now that stance is something that I think all of us can look back and be like, what were we thinking? Like that, back to the 5 years of information, what happened at that point? Now knowing where we all stand, I think everyone is like, yes, support humanity. We all agree. We all want the benefit of everybody. So I think you have to be be true to yourself and be true to what your brand stands for. Like, don't completely go against the grain. But I think right now your consumer probably already has an idea. They just want to hear you say it, and they need that little oomph of support to get past their own kind of woes.
I love that little nugget that you're pulling out, Trevor, which is, and you keep saying 10 years, which I love, because I think so many people right now are feeling like they just fast forwarded 10 years into the future in the last like 8 weeks, 4 months now. So this concept, in terms of advice to give to clients and brands is, think about the future, think about where you want to be as a company in 10 years. And probably, truthfully, what side of history do you want to be on, right? Because folks will remember, and you're setting a tone going forward. So certainly interesting. Jem, I want to give you a chance to share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I am in complete alignment. I think that if brands stay silent, they do more harm than good. And what's so impressive to me about P&G is that they're a product, probably more than any other brand, that really has a universal appeal, right? And yet they decided, we're not going to be this vanilla product that has to please and placate everybody. We're going to do the right thing and stand up for a cause that we believe in, even at the risk of alienating consumers along the way. And so I think that that's super awesome. And it's certainly, me being outside of the millennial generation, despite that, I feel that much more loyalty towards them as a brand. And then I think the other brands that we choose to associate with, I agree with you, Trevor, that we every day choose, the brands that we wear and the brands that we sport, right, are indicative of who we are as people. And so brands are absolutely representing things, right, and representing either stances or personalities or whatever. And so to say that, I'm going to be Switzerland and not going to take any stand is such a cop-out. And for me, I think if a client were to come to me and say, okay, this is a really interesting time, we don't know quite where to go with it. I think the first thing I would say to them is educate yourself on on these issues. What's the history? What have your predecessors done or haven't done? What are some folks in the industry doing that are really leading the charge, and where are you on the spectrum of comfort in terms of being a leader or being a follower? Because I think the brands who are leading, even if they're stumbling as they lead, or the brands are ultimately going to come out of this in a really, really great way. And then I would also say, and I know this is outside the marketing realm, but to the extent that we come in as consultants and that we're not just marketers, but we're business people, I would say, to them to look at their leadership team, right? And so I'm just going to read off this stat because I don't want to get it wrong. But there's only 4 CEOs of the Fortune 500 who are Black. Like, I think that is such a misstep, right? Because to the extent that these brands tend to evolve and pivot based on who's at the helm, I think it's hard to do that, whether it's these times or other times, when your leadership team is so the same, and the perspectives, that you're missing when you have people who look the same sitting at the table, is going to make your brand really stagnant. So to the extent that they can make some moves, whether it's the board, right, or the C-suite or the whatever, I think that that's a great place for them to really not be thinking about long-term change and not just putting out a statement about what they want to, be known for today.
That's such a great concept, because I think a lot of it is, I mean, obviously we're delving a little bit into affirmative action and that type of thing, but a lot of it really truly is that you have a unique perspective on this world. And what we are noticing in 2020 is that women have a unique perspective, Black people have a unique perspective. And so you bring that to the table in such a great way for a company, right? When you are in a leadership position. And that also kind of makes me think a little bit about, so a lot of our clients right now are really focused on, okay, what type of messaging are we putting out there, right? Sensitivity, and then also representing more diversity, right? And so I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there was a very smart Black woman talking. She's an economist, actually. And she had a very distinct memory about the first time she went to a movie theater and she saw Black Panther. And she saw a Black woman as the hero. And she was literally crying as an 11-year-old in the theater because she was like, I'm finally seeing myself represented. I don't have to try to fit myself into a mold of who I'm not. And I think that is a very interesting way that marketers, a very tangible way that marketers and brands can start to bring diversity to the forefront and have different representations of people.
And I think, B2C marketers, it's a lot easier. I think B2B marketers, like, now's your time to step up. And this is the best way that you can show up and be human to your audience. I've been disappointed in my fellow B2B marketing peers and the lack of stance they've taken. I think them personally, they'll say something on LinkedIn or make a post about it. But the companies, I haven't seen them show up, with the exception of HubSpot. I got a really great email from them this morning, and it was a letter from the CEO, and similar to Uncommon Goods, talking about the different ways that, they're going to support Black lives and that Black Lives Matter, and how they, the changes that they're making at HubSpot. But it caught my attention because I'm like, this is one of the first B2B emails I've gotten about this. And it was disappointing when it's all these other retailers that are standing up and saying something and being bold about it. Where are the B2B marketers, and why aren't they standing up? And it's time to not be afraid anymore. So
do you think there's a responsibility on B2B? So I guess there's like a historical thing as marketers, we try to put who we believe the end consumer is into an advertisement. So you kind of see yourself in the ad. As B2B goes, and kind of in that same vein of the stat that Jem mentioned, it's a lot of times that ends up being more, for B2B specific, more kind of Caucasian oriented people. But is there a responsibility, or is there a way to kind of like, for a B2B brand to push kind of that systematic change by going against that grain? And I don't know, I think that would be an interesting one, even from an experiment, like what, because I'm guilty of it myself. Like, we go, if we're targeting a certain audience, we try to put whatever that audience is into the ad. But is there a way to almost kind of forcefully displace change by creating the idea of who's supposed to be in that position in your ad, even though it might not have the same effectiveness today, it might tomorrow, kind of thing?
Yeah.
I think that, Trevor, that is such a great, very actionable point. And the reason why I love that idea of actually, putting somebody in that may not be what you expect is, I think it'll actually capture people's attention more effectively. Like, it'll have inherent stopping power. And a B2C brand that I think has done that really well. I was watching TV this weekend, and I think it's a Pampers commercial, and it's a Black man talking about why he chooses Pampers for his baby. Right. And you think about these type of CPG products where they're showcasing the CMO, right? The chief mom officer, or whatever CMO stands for. I now forget. But it's always the mom, right? Of all shapes and sizes and colors, for sure. But it's most often not the dad, and it's most often not a Black dad. Yeah. And the fact that it was a Black dad on screen made me stop and kind of watch it and figure out, what's the storyline about. So to the extent that we can replicate that in the B2B world, I think it would be really, really awesome from the standpoint of, we're, again, leading the charge, right? Doing the thing that is the right thing in terms of just ability to be more inclusive and diverse. and we're helping the brands that we work on really stand out, which is what we're constantly pushing them to do, right? Independent of the times. I think as marketers, that's almost job one, right? So I love that idea.
I love that too. And I think conversely, we're actually seeing some brands also look at the roles that they're putting minorities in that may not be appropriate, right? So more subservient roles as well. So diversifying some of that. Can you be too sensitive? Can brands are combing through copy. They're looking for mentions of things like slavery or even service, and changing that up. Is there a world in which brands are too sensitive, or should everyone just err on the side of caution right now?
Personally, I think be bold. I think this is the time to be bold. Brands, I feel like now more than ever, like this, you can make a difference. And the responsibility does fall on your shoulders as well. I think one of the quotes that I read from P&G, actually, no, it was from the HubSpot email that I loved, that the CEO cited from Brian Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy. And the quote is, "We are all implicated when we allow others to be mistreated." So I think the other thing too is not being afraid to say things is, we live in a time where you can communicate instantly all of the time. So to not be afraid of missteps, because they're a way of dealing with missteps if maybe, a communication wasn't as well received as you had hoped it to be, even though you had the right intentions. So I think there are ways of overcoming some things that may not be quite perfect. And again, back to the point I made earlier about consumers showing people grace in a time like this, because not everybody's going to get this perfect and they're not going to say it exactly right. It always helps to have, like a marketing agency like Catalyst to run something by to make sure things like tone of voice, word choice, all of those things are on point, and right for the audience.
I have a different perspective on that. I mean, I think you guys know me really well, and so you would be surprised to hear that I'm not saying go be bold all the time. And the reason I say that is there in this article where they're talking about brands, right, that are now evolving from their brand mascots like Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, and Mrs. Buttersworth and that sort of thing, and that there's all these C-suite shakeups at like Bon Appetit and CrossFit and that sort of thing. It's such a great article. And one of the things, there was a quote in here that I'm trying to find, because I just thought this idea that you should be bringing in Black people on your boards or your executive team, because there's some smart ones out there. Like what you know what I mean? Like, it was such an odd
phrasing.
Wow.
Well, it's just, and I wish it were just the phrasing. I actually think that that's what they think, right? And so, right. Like when I look at political parties aside, right? It's like when you look at like President Obama versus President Trump, like all of the words that people put in front of like his name, like, oh, he's, a smart Black guy. It's like they almost have to put a qualifier. There's this need to just, I don't know, almost like help overcome what is going to be potentially, you don't
want to be reckless, and you don't want to be, I think it has to be thoughtful. It has to be intelligent. The tone of voice has to be right. But I think what's great is that it can evolve. Like, it doesn't have to be airtight right now, but just that, that showing that you are taking a stance and you're trying to do something about it, even though it may not be formalized at your company yet, because that's difficult to do for these, for very large enterprise companies. But I think even coming forward and saying, we are working to do this, we don't have this quite right, but here are the areas that we are incorporating this into, like Uncommon Goods did with the suppliers that they have, and then the employees, and then their own financial contribution to social groups.
Right. Well, I think certainly this idea of having humility and stating, I think I saw this great, it was just this man, and he looked maybe like he was a little bit more on the right side of the fence, but anyways, it was in a wheelchair, and he had a sign, and he said, "Sorry, I'm late. I had a lot to learn." And then the other sign he was holding was a Black Lives Matter sign, and he was a white guy. So, of course, I think that there is this level of grace that you can gain just by having that humility in the upfront. Also, it seems like there's an opportunity for brands to, you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to do it in a vacuum. I think you can acknowledge that you don't have expertise in this area, right? And there are people that do have expertise in this area, that deal with trauma, that deal with racial relations and diversity trainings. So bring those people into the mix when you are reviewing how you're going to state things. It always reminds me a little bit of like when somebody says, "Oh, that's actually a good idea." You're like, "What do you mean actually?" Like every idea I have is a good one.
Or maybe
you're actually smart.
But even if you don't think it, like you just leave it out. So here is the quote. It's from the CEO of Xerox, former CEO Ursula Burns. So it says, "Can you just make boards more diverse now? That this is something that is doable. There are African American men and women who actually are capable and willing to serve." Right? Like, no, they're just capable. There's no actually are capable. And so it's those things that just, drive me nuts. Because I think all of us, right, independent of gender, race, everything, are absolutely able to, kind of have at least the opportunity. And then we don't have to put in those qualifiers.
It's a balance of inclusion, yet I still think like there's a level of empathy that you need to have, and even an understanding of like, I think you can't go too far in one direction. There's a barbecue joint back where Robert and I are from that probably went a little too far, and they essentially created discrimination against all except for Blacks, which is they were giving free food and a special offer to anybody that was Black. That you've gone too far, and now you've kind of created, it's actually illegal, but it's also, you've just gone too far. I think that's where it's try to look at, okay, I am taking a very drastic action. I want to be bold and I want to be pure, and I think I have a really great idea, but definitely run it by somebody else. See if you can sit in somebody else's shoes for 10 minutes and see if it would affect them in any negative way. You don't have to rush to market right now. These things aren't going anywhere. So do due diligence and figure out what is going to make the most sense long term.
You guys, so many great nuggets in this. Really great quotes that we pulled out, I'd say. So thank you all for being, speaking of vulnerability, thank you all for being vulnerable and bold and having a conversation that is so worth having. Everyone should be having at their company, but certainly one that requires a little bit of bravery. I think that takes us to the end.
Yeah, and we'll leave this on the words of Uncommon Goods that we have work to do. So, on that note.
That's a good end.